Steve Jones here. That's the beautiful province of Quebec in the background, right down that hill and across the Ottawa River, away from where I'm standing, which is basically a sort of lookout along Storyland Road, which is several miles outside of Renfrew, Ontario. I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the nation of India and of the Indian government. So when you hear me talking about Indians today, I'm not going to be speaking about the ethnicity of the Indian citizens that live in that nation or people who are living in the diaspora, the Indian diaspora here in Canada, nor am I speaking about Canada's Indigenous population. I am limiting myself to political India, meaning the government of India, and more specifically the government of India as led by their current Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. Now, Modi leads a government that is strongly Hindu, and as you probably already know, the two biggest ethnic groups in India are the Hindus, which represent the majority, and then a fairly significant majority are adherents of Islam. So there's a strong Muslim representation in the Indian population. And so domestically, what Modi has been doing ever since he's been in power, and I would think that's probably coming up on 10 years, right around 10 years in power for him. And he has led a very strongly, almost nationalistic, but it's within his own nation, attack on the Muslim population of India. Modi's government views India as a Hindu nation, and the fact that there might be a couple of 100 million people within that nation that represents a pretty sizable majority happen to be Islamic creates a little bit of a problem for those Hindu purists that we find inside Modi's government. And if you think a couple of 100 million people is a lot of people, well, number one, it is, and number two, think about India's population overall. I think we're looking at something in the neighborhood of 1.4 billion people. So 200 or so million Muslims, while it sounds like an awful lot, and it is, but in the whole scheme of the India situation, it's not really. So all of this from a country, now they're putting a lot of pressure on Muslims, and I think, almost to the point where well, not almost, it actually does exist, where violence has broken out within the borders of India directed against elements of the Muslim population. All this in the world's largest democracy. What we've got is we've got one sector of the Indian population that is putting pressure on the other sector of the Indian population, and I think that the hope is probably that these Muslims would probably figure out that life in India is not all that they thought it might be, and it sucks to be a minority within the nation. And so I guess the Hindu majority is kind of hoping that Muslim majority takes a hike and leaves somewhere. Nevertheless, that's an ongoing fight between Hindus and Muslims within India, the nation. Another fight that the Indians have been engaged in for a long, long time is the struggle with respect to Sikh nationalists. Now, these are people who usually originate from the area of the Punjab, which is in northern India, and it is a hotly contested part of India where there is a Sikh majority in that part of the land. And they have been at loggerheads with the Indian government ever since I can remember. And I'm going all the way back to when I was a kid. And, I'm over 60 years old, so that's quite some time. And I think it went back well before that. And so that culminated in a Canadian sense. In a 1985-1986, there was an Air India flight that was flying from Montreal to, I think, Mumbai, but they had a stop in London first, and so somewhere just off the coast of Ireland, the plane blew up. And it killed somewhere in the area of 260 Canadians, a couple of dozen Germans. It killed, I think, 12 Indian nationals. And so subsequently, as years went by and investigations dragged on over to, around the origins of this explosion, it was indeed found to be an example of Sikh nationalist terrorism. So understandably, if India was to be the kind of place that would kind of take that experience and be a little gun shy with respect to the Sikhs, If you would think that India would be the kind of nation that might use this as a pretext to put pressure on the Sikhs, if you think that this might be an opportunity for the Indians to take deadly action, deadly covert action against Sikh populations, not only in India, but diaspora populations like the one in Canada, then you'd be right, because India is no different from anyone else. So, recently in Canada, there's been, parliamentary committees and all sorts of inquiries as to foreign intervention, or foreign interference in Canadian elections, and that's legitimate stuff. India is one of the problems. I mean, we've got Iran, we've got Russia, we've got China, and we've got India. All four of them are doing their nefarious little interference moves in the Canadian political experience. And so it shouldn't be a big surprise to understand that Indian intelligence services, I believe the one that they call now, it's called RAW, the Research and Analysis Wing, or RAW. What a pretty name for an intelligence agency. And I think that this agency is sort of like the equivalent of the American CIA or our CSIS here in Canada. And they have taken a sort of a deadly turn. They've sort of taken a page out of the Israeli playbook, the Mossad playbook, whereas any of their enemies, they will kill them wherever they find them. And too bad, so sad. If it happens to take place in your country, what do you want us to do? We're going to kill terrorists. This is India talking. We're going to kill Sikh terrorists wherever we find them. And if they happen to be living in Canada under your protection, now this is an Indian argument, if they happen to be in Canada under the protection of the government of Canada, in particular the Liberal government of Canada, who's responsible for everything bad in the world, we're going to do what we're going to do. Okay, so fair enough. So it was recently revealed by the Prime Minister that the Indian intelligence services, or this RAW agency, had been implicated in the assassination, or let's not call it an assassination, let's call it the murder of a Sikh Canadian citizen, I believe in Burnaby, BC, somewhere out in British Columbia. Anyways, and so Indian intelligence had their fingerprints all over that, and so that finally came to the attention of the government, and the government finally decided to go public with that. And in what is a case of something that doesn't happen very often, the Canadian government called out the Indian government with respect to this murder in BC, and basically said, hey, you just killed a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, and that's just not cool. So you know what we're going to do, because we're Canada and we hit back hard, we're going to take this senior Indian diplomat that's here in Ottawa working out of your embassy. He's actually the head of this RAW agency within Ottawa. So he's the head of this sort of undercover covert organization that has tentacles here in Canada. And we sent him packing. So, get out of here, go back to India. You're not welcome here. Your poor behavior has made it such that we have to send you home. And of course, the Indians, they hopped up and down and this way and that way. And so they decided to retaliate in kind. And so they picked some random Canadian employee from some Canadian consulate in India, and they sent him packing back to Canada to, teach us a lesson for good right there. So, this went back and forth, and of course the Indians were all offended that we would have the temerity to actually accuse them of such a thing, which in 9 times out of 10 is a pretty good case that they actually did it. And so, but anyways, that back and forth lasted for a couple of weeks until the Americans, through one of their intelligence agencies, released the fact that they were the ones that told us that this was happening in BC, or that this had happened, and that the same cell, the same RAW organization working cell here in Canada was also targeting a number of Sikh, as they referred to them, terrorists in the United States as well. I think they had like 3, 4, perhaps as many as 5 guys that they had targeted for killing. And anyways, this whole thing was exposed. Unfortunately for the Sikh, the gentleman in Burnaby, British Columbia, was a day late and a dollar short. Is that what I'm trying to say? But anyways, yeah, it didn't work much for him because he's dead. But for the other guys, well, they got a little bit of a reprieve. So my point is, the Indians are not the, despite their self-styled title as being the world's biggest democracy, it doesn't mean that they're the world's nicest guys or anything. They are active here in Canada. They interfere with our elections. They get involved with nomination meetings in all parties, but more particularly the Liberals and the Conservatives. That's a way of influencing what happens when you are successful in not only picking a candidate and supporting a candidate and successfully having that candidate win a riding so that that person goes to Ottawa with a vote in the House of Commons. I mean, you do that enough times and what you're going to have is good old-fashioned political interference right here in Canada, and they're doing it all over the place. Wherever democracy is to be found, you can be guaranteed that India is there manipulating it some way to their own ends. No, not to single them out all by themselves. Don't forget Russia, China, and Iran, who are even worse actors than India. But we're talking about India here, so I'll lay a beating into those other guys later. So that's their domestic. That's part of their international relationships with other nations. And I mean, if you're getting into a great big fight with Canada, for heaven's sake, that says something right there. But anyways, let's talk about this Ukraine thing, okay? So obviously back in 2022, the Russians invaded Ukraine and they expected that they were going to take it over in a couple of days and stuff like that. But then the big lie was exposed. See, that's where we found out. Some of us were kind of sneakily suspicious of this, but that's where it became obvious for everyone that the Russians are absolutely full of shit every time they open their mouth. They don't have the second biggest, strongest army in the world. They got the second strongest army in Ukraine, and that's not saying much because the Ukrainians, despite an overwhelming numerical advantage on the part of the Russians vis-a-vis the Ukrainians are just kicking their ass, right, left, center. And I won't go into all the details and stuff, but anyways, as part of this, you know, Russia attacking a country that strives to be a democracy. I mean, they call themselves a democratic country, but they were kind of iffy there to begin with. But anyways, you got Russia violating territorial integrity of another nation, a complete and obvious violation of the Geneva Convention. But what do they care? They don't follow rules and they lie through their teeth every time they get a chance. You know, lying is part of a cultural thing of Russians. Don't believe me? Read books authored by Russians. They'll tell you. Okay. Anyway, so Russia's at war with Ukraine and the whole Western world rallies behind Ukraine, and you can argue about how well they did that or how much they did that or how much they ought to do that. That's another video. But one of the ways that we sort of indicated our displeasure for Russia, or to Russia, is the fact that we were going to economically boycott them and slap a whole bunch of sanctions on their economic activity. Which is fair enough. I mean, oil and gas and this and that and oligarch profits and, you know, money all over the world was frozen. And that was a way to really cripple Russia. And you know what? It worked to a degree. You can never, you know, when you're going to apply sanctions, when you're going to put a blockade around a place, you always have to be aware of people who might try and run that blockade or circumvent that blockade for their own reasons. And so, you know, Russia is sitting on a treasure trove of natural gas and oil, and now nobody's buying it. You know, Western Europe isn't buying it anymore. Nobody else is buying it except for, well, yeah, two people that really matter. If there's other countries buying Russian oil, they're not as significant as these two. One of them is China, who are friends forever with the Russians. Okay. And then there's India, the world's biggest democracy. And they're buying up Russian oil and natural gas, you know, faster than they can shake a stick at it because it's cheap, because the Russians have to sell it. The Indians have leverage on them. Same thing with the Chinese. They have leverage on the Russians. And so now they have to, now they can squeeze the Russians for cheap oil and natural gas, i.e. energy, and so that's what they're doing, allowing them to keep up their efforts in Ukraine. Now, not long ago, Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, went to visit his buddy Vladimir Putin in Moscow, and he swapped some spit with him and gave him the big warm embrace, because they're like buddies forever, right? India and Russia, like, you know, like that, always have been, right? Forever. And that kind of raised some eyebrows in the West, where people started to say, okay, what the fuck's going on with you? All right, you go into Moscow and you make it out like you're best pals with this guy when he's running roughshod over Ukraine and everything that you're supposed to stand for. And here you are, you know, trading hockey cards with him. And so, you know, despite some pressure there, or not despite, but I suppose as a result of pressure that was put on by Ukraine initially and by other people in the Western world, Modry made a trip to Ukraine, I guess, to balance the books with respect to that PR disaster of him visiting Russia. So I'm sure that made Vladdy pretty pissed off there to see Modry in Ukraine. You know, like I thought you were pals with us. But there it is. Now, you know, I can criticize India upside down and side to side and, you know, until every day of the week. You know, it's not hard. But I don't believe that they're actually feeding Russia any military equipment or any components that can be used in military equipment so that Russia can then use against Ukraine. So maybe they are. I just don't know. But what they are doing is they're sending money because they're buying oil and gas. And also I have to say something here about the Indian military, who has for years and years and years and years been buying Russian equipment, including the vaunted S-400 air defense system, which is the greatest air defense system ever devised in the entire history of the world. Anyways, the Ukrainians are shooting the shit out of it, and the Russians have so few of them left. I mean, they've been destroyed by the Ukrainians that Putin has actually had to repurpose them, not repurpose them, but relocate them, including a couple of batteries that he took out. He took away from northern Russia on the border with NATO, on the northern, somewhere around, up by St. Petersburg. He took air defense S-400 batteries from there, and he brought them down to his own personal palace just north of Sochi, or south of Sochi, down in southern Russia, and just to protect his castle. Never mind Russian citizens or anything like that. We know who's at the top of the pecking order there. Anyways, the Indians can't be terribly pleased with the way Russian weapons are performing in Ukraine. And so after they've spent billions and billions and billions of rupees on Russian equipment, now they're kind of having a shit in pants attack because they're seeing the very weapon systems that they have and that they're relying on, ostensibly to use against China or Pakistan if the occasion arises to do so. And they're finding out that this stuff's shit. But that's okay. That's the way we want it, because that's the way everything is in Russia. You know, when was the last time you saw a Russian sports car? They don't exist. If they did, they'd look like a fucking refrigerator. But anyways, I'm off topic. So we got a little bit of sleaziness here from the Indians, you know, pumping money into Russia while Russia's putting the boots to a democracy over here in Ukraine. And we're expected to think that they're democracies like we are? I mean, come on. You know, that whole India, Russia, China thing, come on. You know, you guys, especially China and Russia, and how much they love one another. Oh my God. My finger isn't long enough to jam it as far down my throat as I want to get my gag reflex going. Anyways, long story short, when are we going to do something about this? When are we going to shut these guys down? You know, when are we going to say to India, hey, you guys need to fuck off? You know what I mean? Shut them fucking down. Shut that money down so Russia can't use it to build weapons, okay? What are you, North Korea? What are you, Iran? Give me a break. You're supposed to be the world's biggest democracy. Why don't you start acting like it? My apologies for anyone of Indian ethnicity who I have managed to offend with this presentation. That was not my intent. I wanted to call out your government, who's a little rough around the edges. I'm Steve Jones, standing in front of the province of Quebec, which is down the hill and across the Ottawa River from where I'm standing here at a lookout along Storyland Road, just outside of beautiful downtown Renfrew.